Hi all. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. If we haven't had the chance to meet before, I'm Rachel. I lead customer marketing at Posit, and I also co-host our weekly data science hangout. I'm joined by my other co-host here behind the scenes, Libby. But I know many of you are already Posit customers, but just in case Posit is new to you today, Posit builds enterprise solutions and open source tools for people who do data science with R and Python. We are also the company formerly called RStudio, which is why my mug is the RStudio one, not the Posit one today. But I'm so excited to have you here for this special event today. So I'm joined by Wes McKinney, entrepreneur and open source software developer, focusing on data science tools and analytical computing. Wes is co-creator of Pandas, Apache Arrow, and IDEs projects, and currently principal architect at Posit. And I'm also joined by Hadley Wickham, chief scientist at Posit. Hadley builds tools to make data science easier, faster, and more fun. His work includes packages for data science like the tidyverse, which includes ggplot2 and dplyr. So for today's session, this is going to be a casual chat for us all to ask questions and exchange insights with each other about cross-language collaboration. But we at Posit are also really excited to learn from you and to better understand how your teams work with both our free and open source projects, but also our professional products like Posit Workbench and Posit Connect. So I do encourage you all to connect with each other here too in the chat. If you've been on our data science hangouts before, this is one of my favorite things, people getting to know each other through the chat. So if you want to briefly introduce yourself and say hi, maybe include your role, where you're based, something you do for fun, or feel free to share LinkedIn as well. That's your chat is yours to share resources with each other. There were so many great questions submitted ahead of time, which I can definitely start with. However, today you can jump in too and ask questions that come up live, and if you want to share your own experience. So you could put questions in that chat. If it's anything you want me to read out loud instead, you could put a little asterisk next to it. But we do also have a Slido link where you can ask questions anonymously too. And if I end up missing something, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom and we can call you to jump in there too. Real quickly, we did keep this to a smaller group today, so I will be sharing the recording more broadly. I just want to make sure I let everybody know that, but I can also send the recording to you all later this week as well. But thank you again so much for being here today, and let's jump in. I know Wes and Hadley, I just briefly introduced yourself, but if you want to say hello here first too, and maybe also let us know something you do for fun outside of work. Okay,
Sure.
Hadley, go first.
I'll let Hadley go first.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Hadley. As Rachel said, I'm chief scientist. I make lots of R packages. And outside of work lately, I've been doing crochet.
I was just thinking of buying one of those the other day, those kits.
Yeah, I got into it from Wooples, which make it super easy to get up and go, and I'd highly recommend it for a Christmas present. And the fun, cool Wooples connection is that the people who started Wooples were actually one of them was an ex-data scientist from Google who actually used R and tidyverse in the previous life. So I thought that was pretty awesome.
That is, I had no idea. All right, Wes.
Yeah, so I'm Wes. I live in most of the time I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Over the last year at Posit, I've been I would say mostly working on Positron, which is a new polyglot data science IDE that's in public beta. I'm pretty excited about where that's going. Rejoined Posit about a year ago, but have been we've been collaborating actively on Arrow and making polyglot data science projects work better, making Python and R play nicely together since gosh, must be going back to like 2015 or 2016, so coming up on a decade. So been a pretty long collaboration. and with the open source tools, and it's great to be able to work together on a day-to-day basis in the company.
I guess we released Feather in like 2016.
2016, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the fun thing outside of work, let's see. I'm big, big on cooking and cocktails. I know Hadley's also really into making cocktails, maybe more than me, but during the wintertime I enjoy doing like kind of large braises, putting something in the oven to cook for 5 or 6 hours, and that makes for a really fun dinner party.
I think you both have a lot of similarities in your hobbies, right? Don't you also both like to do yoga?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we've never done yoga together, to my knowledge.
Yeah.
No,
I think at work week. So
maybe.
let me jump in with some of the questions people submitted ahead of time, and we could start early days here. So the first one is, how did you both get into open source? Wes, do you want to go first?
Yeah, for me it was a bit stumbling into it because I started doing Python programming back in like 2007, and I was working inside a hedge fund where all the code was very secret and there was no open source, and even using open source was a little bit dicey. You had to be really careful about what code you pull in, and everything was really scrutinized. But I had learned about the scientific Python community and started looking into these different projects and how they became open source projects and what was an open source project. And at a certain point, this was like the middle of 2009, I decided that I really wanted to open source what was then very early version of Pandas as an open source project. And so that led me to, I finally got permission to do that. And then I went to my first PyCon in 2010, and that was like my first foray in the Python community. And a lot of the folks in the scientific Python community, like NumPy, SciPy, people who go to the SciPy conference, like they, I met them, and then they mentored me in like how to do open source, how to build open source communities, and just became a bit of an addiction, I guess, after that, and really enjoy working in public and building tools that are freely available on the internet and have a lot of impact.
Awesome. And Hadley, what about you? Why data science for you?
Yeah, so I in like high school I really enjoyed both like programming and statistics. And so I ended up doing a double major in computer science and statistics, which at the time seemed like a weird combination to a lot of people, but is now obviously what we call data science. So I did that at the University of Auckland, which was the home of R. So as far as I can tell, I actually started using R in 2003. And I had to look up, and that was R version 1.6, which is a little horrifying to me that I've been using R for like 21 years now. So R was open source, and that just kind of felt natural to me to like try and develop R packages and release them in open source, and just like such a great way to have like an impact on the world. And my original career track was like more academia, thinking I would be a professor somewhere one day. And it just seemed to me like open source was just such a great way to get your ideas in the world, and not just provide like a text description of what you're working on, but to provide code that people could actually use to implement your work.
Okay, let me jump into some of the package type questions, but I see a few coming into the chat as well. So thank you all for putting questions there too. I noticed a few of the pre-submitted questions focused on pandas, and also mentioning polars. So I'm curious, Wes, how do you envision pandas evolving over the next year in response to performance first single machine data frame libraries? That is a mouthful. Let me copy the questions into the chat so you all can see them too.
Yeah. This is a pretty common question. Because Pandas has millions of users, it's very hard to make large sweeping changes to the project. So some years ago, back when we were starting the Arrow project, which provides kind of a more efficient data management layer. So like a place to store data efficiently in memory, and then compute all the data frame operations really efficiently against that data. There was a discussion about, could we make large sweeping changes to Pandas to make it a lot faster, more efficient, have better scalability and memory use at the single node. But ultimately we found that, making significant changes would cause too much disruption to people that depend on Pandas for all of their business applications. And so over the last 10 years, I haven't been actively involved in day-to-day development in Pandas, but it's been really careful to introduce new components, to refine the internals, to make them, more efficient. But ultimately, like, the project has to preserve its API and not make changes too quickly, because that risks breaking people's code and harming people that don't have tests for their production code. One of the big changes has been the introduction of like a more robust extension arrays system. So that enables people to use Arrow arrays in their Pandas data frames, so they can get a lot more efficient string data types and get better analytics performance that way. There have been some other performance and memory use applications around the project. But in terms of like, really high performance computing for data frames, I think that's mostly been happening in the DuckDB and Polars projects. You can feed a Pandas data frame into DuckDB and use DuckDB to execute on it. And I think maybe similarly with Polars. But, without the burden of supporting over a decade worth of legacy code and an existing API, it's been nice for projects like Polars to be able to like rethink the data frame API and build something new from the ground up that's focused on performance and scalability, but also with a much smaller API. And so the way I describe Polars to people, it's like a much smaller, simpler API. There's no row labels. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that makes things more complicated in Pandas that doesn't exist in Polars. So I think Polars is, maybe more similar to an R data frame, or, if you're using dplyr, the dplyr API and the Polars API are very similar.
So I thought I would be able to quickly find who asked that question and be able to pull you on, but I wasn't able to. So if that was your question and you want to ask any follow-up as well, feel free to jump in here too. So Skylar, I see you had asked a question in the chat, and I would love to have you ask that live if you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure. It's buried somewhere in the chat. So I work for the Washington State Department of Health. We have a pretty large user base of R users. We also have quite a few Python users, as well as like our technical capability continues to expand. And we've been struggling creating documentation that serves both of those communities. So with the advent of Posit Workbench coming to us soon, and with the advent of things like Positron and these polyglot IDEs, some of us use VS Code too, so Positron shouldn't be that big of a leap there. But we've been trying to create documentation that can serve both communities better with Quarto, especially since Quarto works well in Python and R. But we've had challenges using them together. So we want to use Quarto to share documentation with different contexts, same documentation, but quickly switching between R and Python for our users that need to see one language or the other. They usually don't know both. It's usually only R or only Python. And I was just curious, is there examples out there or recommendations that you might have for creating this type of documentation that we can switch between quickly?
There's one thing that
Go ahead.
I'm sure I saw in Quarto, and that's with you can use tab sets. And I think if you give the tab sets all the same name, you can kind of switch them globally on a page. So then you can have like, an R code and Python code, each in their own tab. And then when you pick one for Python, that changes everywhere. I can't find that on the Quarto docs. So maybe I imagined it, or maybe it's not documented. But I know that was something that came up in some of our internal discussions as we, start to create more packages that work with both R and Python as well. So that's definitely something to try with the tab sets if you're not already.
Great. Yeah, and I'll take a look. I'm curious about the global switching because that would be perfect. I'm just not sure how to implement that yet. So I'll dig
Yeah,
around.
I think yeah. And if it doesn't work, just like ask because it should work.
Okay.
I just found this. I was just Googling and I found this Quarto extension called Tabby, Tabby, that just makes it easier to like create code blocks with tab sets. So you could say like switch between like the R version of the code block and the Python version of the code block. I'm not endorsing. I haven't used the package, but it came up in case that's interesting.
I just found in the doc, so I dropped a link in the chat. So it is supported. You have to add a group thing to your tab sets.
Okay, great. These are great recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I see, Manuel, you had asked a question when you registered about Positron, and I'm seeing some excitement about Positron in the chat too. And feel free to jump in if you want to add any more context too. But the question was, in what ways does Posit see using the best of both for R and Python development occurring in Positron?
Am I the only Manuel?
Sorry, Manuel. Yes, that's you.
Yeah, and I guess, I was going to add a different question slightly on this theme. So I'll embellish it if you all will allow me. I'm with ExxonMobil, so I'm with a large enterprise, and we have many products, many solutions. One of them is Databricks. And I get the sense that the individuals very passionate in either community are accustomed to their IDE of choice, right? So it was RStudio or Spider or whatever, and now maybe Positron. But I'm finding myself having to build solutions that are so large that I'm not certain if that's the right home anymore. So maybe the question can be, what's the continuing value proposition for something like Positron when the landscape continues to change and the scale of things that people are being asked to build could grow, right? So I get it if I'm modeling, if I'm deploying something to predict, that IDE experience is very powerful, but for a lot of what I have to do for business intelligence or analytics, they just want to report. So I don't necessarily need that, right? So I kind of wandered. I hope I didn't get us too crazy.
I don't know if you want to take a stab at that, Wes, or I can.
Sure. Well, so I don't know how much folks in this call know about Positron, but the idea of Positron was to develop the, kind of, you can think of RStudio pioneered what we can think of as the classic 4-pane data science layout with the console, the code editor, the variables pane, and the plots pane. And so you can move between, and there's some other components like the connections pane for interacting with databases, the data viewer for being able to look at your data frames and your tabular data. But having that each of those concepts as first-class citizens within a development environment is really powerful. And I think RStudio has shown that, over the last 15 years, with its enduring popularity. And so the idea with Positron is that we wanted to create that same kind of experience and make it available to Python users, but in a polyglot first IDE. So but it's a kind of a difficult problem to build from the ground up, something that works equally well in R and Python and supports all of those different components. So we chose to build Positron on top of the open source VS Code base. So we have basically an extensive set of customizations and components that we've built on top of open source VS Code. And we've created that kind of hybrid IDE where you can, within the IDE, you can have both an R session and a Python session running. And so you might have one tab that's an R program where you're doing something in R, and then another tab that's Python. And whenever you switch contexts, it will change the session, the active session, and that will change the variables that are displayed, the plots, and the different components in that four-pane data science layout. You can imagine this has been an awful lot of engineering, but I think it reflects kind of how like we as a business are thinking about building tools, going forward, being building things polyglot from the ground up. Similar ideas with Quarto, and Connect is also kind of being built as a polyglot application and document publishing platform. So it's going to take a long time before Positron. Well, I should qualify. It will take some time before Positron is able to reach the level of polish that RStudio has after 15 years of development. But it's an early stage project. We're really interested in feedback and users. I think it will be available as a preview, kind of in preview alpha beta form in Posit Workbench, in the near future. I'm not sure, maybe in the first quarter of next year. And then, we're hoping for it to become generally, GA production at the end of, toward the end of next year, or early 2026 in terms of timeline. But we're making a big investment there, and supporting those, not only Python first teams, the people who are just using Positron for Python, we want them to have a great experience, but also teams that have a lot of R users and Python users. We want them to be able to work effectively within the development environment and switch between the R context and the Python context.
And just to kind of emphasize what Wes said about polyglot, I mean, that today that means R and Python. But the idea is that we've built this foundation that no matter what the next data science language or environment is, like, we can build the tooling for that. So you've got that one place that you can be using all of your favorite data science tools, regardless of what language or tool set you're using.
Thank you. Realizing we have so many questions that we may not get to, but we will figure out some way to keep that conversation going and answer all these questions. But to deep dive on that a little bit, there was another question that was, I'm using Python and R for analytics and production. How can Posit Workbench or Connect help us integrate Python scripts and R models into a cohesive and efficient workflow?
I think, the goal of both Workbench and Connect is to put R and Python on equal footing. So regardless of whether you're using R or Python, you can, develop your scripts in the same editing environment, and you can publish them to the same, the same environment using the same tools. So I think that's really about helping, both like 100% R and 100% Python teams or even individuals work effectively. And then how do we make sure those teams, the R users and the Python users, can collaborate as effectively as possible? And to me, that's mostly happening on the open source side. Like, that's making sure, like on the R side, that we have this nano Parquet file so that you can read in R, read and write Parquet files, which are a great way of sharing data with your Python using colleagues. There's things like the pins package, which we have for both R and Python, that allows you to save data sets and share them with your colleagues really easily. Tools like Vetiver for model monitoring that work in both R and Python. Great tables that work with both R and Python. So having these tools where you end up with like a shared vocabulary and a shared tool set and shared conventions around storing and using data, that hopefully, ease some of those boundaries a little.
Thank you. I was trying to add those links as quickly as I could, but I might need some help from everybody.
Yeah, I see Jeffrey mentioned Orbital, which is another really cool tool, which basically lets you take your tidy models workflows and convert them to SQL. And obviously, once you've got your model predictions computed in SQL, you can deploy that in any database, which is just such a really cool idea.
Okay, let's take a quick detour to the AI conversation. I see some questions submitted ahead of time on AI and also, well, LLMs. What is Posit's roadmap for LLMs, both for folks developing LLM apps and for developers using Posit products?
I don't know if we're at the point where we like have a roadmap, I'd say, but we have a lot of kind of, I would say, like internal skunkworks projects on the go to try and figure out like what do LLMs mean for data scientists, both for like doing data science, whether that's like extracting structured data from unstructured text, or like writing the code that you use to do data science. So we're exploring a bunch. Personally, I've been working on the Elma package for R, which makes it easy to use any of a range of LLM providers from R programmatically. That's hopefully going to go to CRAN tomorrow, or maybe the day after, or maybe Friday, failing that. And then I think we're really thinking about how should LLMs and Positron interact? Like, is there something special for data scientists? Is this just like kind of a generic programmer software engineering problem, and we can integrate with all the existing tools like Continue or Codium or any of the 17 other LLM VS Code extensions that I forget the name of? But no roadmap, but I think a lot of interest, a lot of excitement, and a lot of experiments happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we're looking closely at is how, because I assume that a lot of people in the call have used Copilot or have used one of the other like LLM VS Code extensions like Continue. Like I personally recently just switched from using Copilot to Continue, and so you install the Continue extension. It's basically like it's kind of like an open source Copilot, auto completion, and it does code editing and chat kind of within, and you plug in your own API key from your preferred model. Like I'm using Anthropic, like the Anthropic API. Like it's very inexpensive to use, but you could also plug in like an OpenAI API key. It uses Mistral for code completion. So like Mistral has an code auto completion model called Codestral. That's like, I think one of the best kind of the best low latency autocompleter models that's out there. So I've been learning a lot about that. But I think one of the things that we're taking a close look at is how we can take a general purpose LLM AI assistant that's for software engineering and augment the context with information from the data science environment. So that's things like the column names in your data frames and kind of other information that we can cheaply glean about the active data science environment to make the prompts and the suggestions from the AI more contextually helpful based on what you're doing. And so if the LLM is just looking at the code in your code editor, it may lack the context that is that can be picked up from looking deeply at the data. And so it's you can imagine this is a kind of a pretty significant engineering problem. And we also I think we want to make sure that we don't bite off more than we can chew, and that we're taking advantage of what's out there and not building too much from scratch ourselves.
Josh, I see that was your question. Thank you. Do you have anything you wanted to ask as a follow-up?
I wish I had something thoughtful to add. My head's kind of similar to those lines. I added in the chat, like at this point, most of the LLMs we're using are an API endpoint. Where I work, we've developed an internal fast API to hook us into every LLM we need. So, I'm able to develop with LLMs right in R. I'm not stuck using Python for everything. I'd say the one place I'm still kind of stuck being behind in R is vector databases, RAG, network searches, that kind of stuff. So that's still where I'm struggling a little bit to kind of argue to our leadership that it's worth sticking with R when, well, if you want to do reg, you have to develop it in Python, use Chroma or Face or whatever else.
I will say I am planning, that's very much on my to-do list for next year, is to do a package for rags in R.
That'd be
and
awesome.
What I currently have to show for it is I have a name and a logo, but hopefully next year there will be some. I'll put the logo in the chat.
Well, one neat thing, I don't know, I haven't built anything with it personally. I've just seen demos, but there is like a chat widget in Shiny. So if you have a Shiny dashboard or something that you're building, and there are components that could enable you to add a kind of an LLM chat sidebar to a dashboard or Shiny application. And so I think there's lots of, with a little bit of, legwork, if you're willing to spend the energy to, twiddle with generating prompts from your the other metadata in your Shiny dashboard, that could be used to build some pretty interesting things. But I think it's definitely early days in terms of realizing the full implications of all of the different things we can do with these tools.
That's where I'm headed as well. I think we can get there. R for Shiny and even reg, we're moving towards an API endpoint rather than requiring certain hardware. So I'm hoping to build the next iteration is get off of Streamlit Chainlit and try something right in our Posit Connect next year. Thank you both.
So another question was, are you using AI? And if yes, which part of your way of working could benefit most from AI? And Hadley, I'm wondering if this hex image was created with AI now.
Yeah, a lot of my hexes now are created by like I use DALL-E to do a bunch of kind of experimentation to kind of like get the sense of like what I want, and then I work with one of our designers at Posit to kind of finish it off. But I found them like really useful for brainstorming hex logos. More usefully for work, I guess I find them super useful when I'm programming in areas that I'm not that familiar with. Like doing like web development, some stuff there, it's just really useful. Like I can kind of read JavaScript if it's been written for me, but writing it is painfully slow. So having someone like at least get me 90% of the way there makes a huge improvement to my productivity. And I could also look at my like chat GPT. I use it, I don't know, I use it for a lot of ridiculous stuff. But I did also actually I used it recently. I was in Japan and I asked chat GPT to create a walking tour of Kyoto that avoided tourist spots, and it did a pretty good job. Not coding. But,
What about you, Wes?
Yeah, I think my use of AI is similar to Hadley's. I mentioned that I currently use the continue VS Code extension, and that's relatively recent. And I actually held out on using Copilot for a long time because I felt like it's like, hey, I don't need an AI to help me write code. But then I found myself working on code bases, and especially like JavaScript and TypeScript code bases where there's just a lot of concepts and things that I was not familiar with, a lot of like library code that I didn't fully understand, as well as like a new programming language. And so I find that it really helps me like with the blank slate problem of starting in on something new. And I could spend, in the old days, I would spend an hour Googling things and looking up how to do stuff on Stack Overflow, whereas now I can ask it to insert some template code, get me started. Maybe it's not right the first time, but then I can edit it to my satisfaction. I also find that it's very really good at refactoring stuff. So I used to manually refactor code, but the other day I started to refactor some code, and as soon as I started doing, I think the autocompleter just realized what I was doing and made all of the right suggestions. And so rather than having to type out the thing I was doing, I just pressed, tab 5 or 6 times and it did exactly what I wanted to do, kind of like magic. So, I think there's a certain set of places where it really helps, with boilerplate and stuff where, stuff you could do, but maybe you'd have to do some Googling and things you're not familiar with. But I found it's definitely made me a lot more productive. And like Hadley, I've also used it for, plenty of, just general life stuff like creating new recipes, modifying recipes, help with travel planning. So like, I also recently went to Japan and like we used ChatGPT to like, do a bunch of travel planning and it was super helpful. So if you haven't tried it for that, I definitely endorse.
Yeah, I think like to me, like the use cases where it's not like the place where it's best is like the sort of brainstorming stuff. You're not like, you never really trust it 100%, but it often gets you like 90% of the way there. And in places where like it doesn't have accuracy isn't like, but the other kind of framing I think of it as like all of those things you used to Google and you just kind of blindly trust whatever you get with Google. And if it's a recipe, you've also got to scroll through 15 pages of the person's life story before you actually get to the recipe. Like ChatGPT is like almost uniformly better for those kind of tasks where like actually getting the 100% correct answer is not that important, but you're really just looking for a starting point.
On the recipe one of my favorite websites is just the recipe. You put in the link and it just cleans it up. Let's see. Adam, you had asked a question here in the chat a little bit earlier. Do you want to jump in here next?
Yeah, this gets back to a conversation we were having earlier around just sort of like the R and Python like relationship and interoperability. And the question is mainly around like what Emily Reeder calls the ergonomics of the language. Like I find myself when I work in R, I'm really used to the tidyverse. It has a very, I think, natural kind of workflow, thinking about how you wrangle data. When I go into Python, like my brain breaks and I just can no longer think about how to manipulate that. I feel so dumb, it's like that meme, like, do you know how smart I am in R, right? And I'm wondering if Posit, well, I'll back up. There are these community-led initiatives to kind of make Python in some ways feel a bit more like that tidy workflow, right? They're out there. I'm wondering if Posit is investing in ways to sort of unify the language ergonomics so that the switch between the languages is more natural, not just in like the IDEs and the tools, but like the language APIs themselves.
I mean, Wes might have another perspective, but I think we are doing this a little bit in terms of like packages like GT and Great Tables.
Yeah.
Like ggplot2 and plot9, and I think dplyr has influenced polars a lot. But at the same time, I have to say, like, I find like Python packages really strange too. And like, I think the thing that I find the weirdest and strangest about Python packages is they don't have like logos. They don't have hex logos and they don't have stickers. And I think that's like really weird and disturbing. And that's why you should use R, because we have cool stickers.
Well, case closed then, I guess.
It's funny. I never really thought about the the logos thing until working more with the R community. And it's we should I think it would be good to have to have more logos. Well, on the API front, I know that I started a project called IDEs, which is like a portable data frame API, very much inspired by dplyr. Getting on almost a decade ago. There's kind of a growing community of people that have built that and built out like different backends to, works really well with DuckDB out of the box and Polars and Pandas, and you can use it with BigQuery and Snowflake and Presto and all these things. And so I think that's been one area where it's been a little bit under the radar because everybody uses Pandas, and so they're not thinking as much about like, hey, what's the value of a portable data frame API. But there's another project called Narwhals, which is like similar to IBIS, but is using the Polars API as like the kind of the API interface. So it's similar. I think narwhals is like the way that dbplyr is related to dplyr in terms of, you know, making dplyr expressions run on databases. I think narwhals is the same concept, but for the Polars API. But I agree that stuff like, you know, the Python port of Great Tables helps, at least with like for the data presentation problem, like reducing some of the cognitive dissonance moving between languages. There's plot9, which is basically a Pythonic port of ggplot2. So if you're looking for something that maps semantically, if you're used to ggplot2 and you want to be able to express, you know, things in the same way in Python, you can do that. But you know, it's because the Python ecosystem is so big and so federated, like it's a little bit more of the Wild West, whereas like the R ecosystem is like more curated and there's more of like a kind of at least within stuff in the greater, you know, tidy cinematic universe, there's a little more of like ideological consistency of like we have to make all these libraries work well together, and so that's helped create like a cultural cohesion that isn't as present in the Python kind of in the Python world, because it's so federated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, do
But
you
I
think
know
it's
it's
a
something we talk about at least, and something we're trying to make better, but it's difficult. It's a very, you know, it's a very big ship that we're trying to, you know, steer with a small rudder. So it takes time to make changes, and you have to almost like, you know, there's a lot of noise that has to be tuned out. You know, choose to use fewer tools and ignore other stuff. But it's I can appreciate that it's difficult.
do you think that our language cohesion is a function of just the, like R is just a smaller language in general, there's just fewer players, and as you scale you kind of inevitably have this like volume and noise like you're talking about?
I think I mean, Hadley would probably have a better view, but my outside impression is that the is not necessarily, it's not just about the language size or the community size, but more of like I think that the developer community is more cohesive and more kind of like there's more dialogue and collaboration. And so I think there's been like more of a like an active effort where like with like the tidyverse is kind of this, you know, gravity well, like it's created almost like a kind of a desire within the
Black hole.
community to sort of create things that work play nicely together, that are cohesive for the benefit of like kind of end-to-end productivity. It's like, oh well, you want to build a new thing, well, it needs to work well kind of within this ecosystem of tools to play nice with people that are using, you know, these other, you know, 15 packages in their daily workflow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the R community is smaller and it feels more centralized. Like another kind of interesting difference is the difference between CRAN and PyPI, where CRAN is like such a pain if you're a package developer, because you are responsible for making sure your package is compatible with all the other, you know, you're not breaking other packages on CRAN. Whereas with PyPI, really, really easy to deploy a package to PyPI, but now it's the user's responsibility to debug package incompatibilities. And so there's just something I feel like the R community is kind of more centralized by nature. And that's, you know, there's lots of good things about that. And there's obviously lots of good things about being more decentralized and spread out like the Python community.
Yeah, thanks so much.
The one thing that I think about in the decentralized version is like when we have a tidyverse dinner or something and we're all walking, I'm like, you probably shouldn't all cross the road at the same time. That could be like really bad. The bus like is definitely not one, but if a bus hit the whole team, it would be pretty bad.
So I see there's a lot of questions about using R and Python together, because I think most teams have both R and Python users now. But one was, what is your recommended architecture or approach for creating a blended web-based application?
I have no idea. So
So like a blended in the sense of like one that uses both, like both R and Python, is that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly who asked the question, but I'm imagining there's a team that has both R and Python users, and they're working on a project together where the output is some web app that someone's using to make decisions.
Okay. I mean, I guess you have to make a decision, like where is the like the front end portion of the app built, like whether you build build the application in R, say using Shiny, or in Python using Shiny, Streamlit, or Dash, or I think they're all supported in Connect, for example. So you can publish, choose your app framework, choose your fighter basically, and then you can publish it. And then if you need to cross between the languages from Python, you can call R code that's within the application using, I guess it's RPy2 is the thing that people use, and then from R you can call Python code with reticulate, and so it's a bit of a choose your based on like where you want to maintain the application portion of things. Maybe in some ways like building, or in many ways like building the application layer in R is kind of a lot nicer in many ways, kind of in the publishing experience, especially if you're working within RStudio. I know I think we're kind of working to achieve the same level of like one-click publishing and kind of making application development work as smoothly for Python, the Python app frameworks, and Positron as they do for if you're building an application in R and RStudio. So in time, I think they'll be roughly equivalent, but yeah, it's a little more. I think there's maybe some complexity involved with like managing your code environment, because you have like your R package environment and your Python package environment, but I'm not sure what's like the state of the art for like keeping those synchronized.
Yeah, I see, Darren, you actually had a question on that as a team that uses both R and Python. I think it was something about packages. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think Wes kind of addressed that, but even with Posit, like they support both R packages and equivalent ported Python packages, and I was curious from a engineering perspective, like how you're maintaining those and keeping those synchronized, or maintaining those in a way where it makes sense to developers and maintaining them going forward. I guess like what are the challenges, and like what advice do you have for teams that have internal packages in R that also need to have those in Python?
Hadley, you want to give that one a go?
Not really, but I commented on another thread asking the same question, saying that would be worthwhile maybe having Edgar and Spritch come and talk to this meeting about that, since they both have experience developing both R and Python packages simultaneously. I think they would have some good ideas about how can you minimize the amount of like copying and pasting you're doing. I think that's another place where it seems like LLMs are really useful, or getting increasingly more useful, like translating code from one language to another. Certainly not going to be 100% correct, but will it radically speed up, translating from one system to another? I suspect so.
Okay, thank you. And I am excited to go through this chat and see all the follow-up actions later as well. But Sam, I see you asked a question earlier. I'm going to recopy it here. Do you want to ask that next? And Sam Tyner Monroe.
Thanks. Hi. Yeah, I'm an R user, and I manage some people who use Python, and of course with LLMs, everybody's using Python more. But as someone, for those of you with experience going from R to Python, what are your favorite resources for package documentation, tutorials, other sort of learning materials generally? And I saw somebody else in the chat too say that, Python documentation tends to be quite difficult to learn from and understand compared to R package documentation. But yeah, just wondering what some good resources might be. Thanks.
I see Hadley, you're unmuted. Wes, you're unmuted. Who wants to go first?
I know at least like I think I know that like Quarto has been helping a lot for Python packages. There's it's called Quarto Doc, and so it's like it helps with like a number of Python projects have moved over to building their websites, kind of hybrid of documentation, blogs, tutorials, like where they publish content for their packages, like through through doing it through doing it with Quarto. And so in terms of like if you have projects that are doing documentation both for our stuff and for Python stuff, that definitely helps with having fewer tools to master in terms of authoring and publishing content. But yeah, it is challenging. I mean, there's many different documentation frameworks. I think in Python there's not only Quarto Doc, but there's still Sphinx, and there's MKDocs, and there's a number of other documentation frameworks. But I think I've been advising a lot of most people to move not only their code blogs and anything code related or Python related, to move things over to Quarto, just because of the the benefits of working within a within a polyglot polyglot framework.
Yeah, I think the surprising thing to me is just how, like, the other thing that Python kind of lacks that R has pretty deeply ingrained is the idea of vignettes. Like, I think Python generally, there's lots of, there's good function and method documentation, but that idea of having these like longer form documents which explain, like, that's just less baked into the kind of the packaging system in Python than it has been in R. I think partly because R always had this much very strong academic connection where there's this idea, at least historically, like if you're writing an R package, you're also going to write a paper about it. So you want somewhere to put that like long form, detailed technical discussion.
I'm getting this like nervous energy as we get to the end because we have so many great questions still. But one of the other questions was frameworks like Polars and DuckDB are making what was big data smaller. Do you see any trends or further innovations in this area?
I mean, I think these projects will continue to get better and attract just more add-on third-party library integrations and just become more integrated and useful within like the mainstream programming environment, both in Python and R. Posit has a relationship, has worked with DuckDB Labs on integrating DuckDB with dplyr, and we made similar investments kind of in making dplyr work better, or not dplyr, but DuckDB work better with Python. And so yeah, I think that my hope is that Polars and DuckDB just become more and more popular and widely used, and that we don't end up with like 10 different projects that are solving similar problems. But it is true that these tools have really opened up, especially on big machines with like big servers with lots of cores and lots of RAM. What you can do on a single machine now is pretty impressive. And there's fewer and fewer cases where you need to spin up a distributed cluster and use Spark. So if having just the ability to work at a single node, or if you're working in the cloud to say, oh well, I'm working on a big problem and I can spin up a large instance to do something with DuckDB, that's amazing. And to not have to go through the complexity of porting a workflow to use Spark and run something in EMR or whatnot.
Yeah, I think that the trend that's really interesting to me is the kind of the unbundling of like data storage and compute. Like when you look at like MySQL and Postgres, they have a completely different way of storing data on disk. But now, like you have a directory of Parquet files, you can use that with DuckDB, you can use that with Arrow, you can use it with Polars, you can use it with Athena, and just that idea that like you can compute on your data with lots of different engines, I think is really powerful. And tools like DuckDB and Polars are bringing those, to your laptop so that you can be working with, gigabytes of data pretty easily. And makes it, I think, gives you a much higher speed of iteration than having to work with a tool like Spark, where you're, get to create a job that gets spread over a bunch of computers, or aggregated back together and sent to you. So I think a really, really interesting trend.
Thank you. Libby, I know you had a question. Do you want to go next?
Sure. My question was, who are your data heroes? Because you two are probably aware that you are lots of other people's like data heroes or programming heroes. Who are yours?
I don't know about data heroes, but I'd say one of my, JJ is definitely one of my programming heroes. Because I think the thing that I think, there's many things that are incredible about JJ, but the thing that I find most incredible is his willingness to move from an area where he is like an expert and knows it down pat to a new area where he knows nothing. And that, I think, is just like an incredible, that's sort of incredibly brave and an incredible tool to be able to say, I'm a master. I've mastered this. And now I'm going to go over here and become a novice again. That I just have a huge amount of admiration for that.
Yeah, I mean, I've become a big fanboy of the DuckDB creators like Mark and Hannes. I know Rachel mentioned that there's a data science hangout on Thursday with Hannes, who's one of the creators of DuckDB. And in addition to being just super really just super nice people, occasionally a bit sarcastic and with very dry humor. But they're they're really great people and really collaborative, and I've just been impressed with their willingness to take on any problem and say, oh, we're unfazed by, we're going to make DuckDB work on this problem, and we're going to make DuckDB do this, we're going to make DuckDB do that. And so I think what they've been able to accomplish with a small team, kind of run circles around many startups that have 100 engineers, and just goes to show that it isn't about the number of developers working on a project, that small teams of people who are really, really focused and motivated can really accomplish great things. And in general, I've been really excited to have just more collaboration between the traditionally pretty crusty, stodgy, uncollaborative database community. It's a pretty insular community with mostly commercial software projects. And so to have not only an open source database project, but one that is collaborating with folks like Hadley and me with open arms has been really exciting, and opened up a lot of kind of new, as I think made the future a lot more interesting.
Thank you so much. Okay, so maybe one quick last question. What's something that you both are excited about for the next year ahead?
I will say, kind of echo, building off what Wes said, another project I think is incredible is Types, which is this, recreation of LaTeX, or everything that LaTeX could do in terms of creating high quality PDF publications. That's something I just assumed I would never see a replacement for LaTeX in my lifetime, because it was just too big and too complex. And the Types development team, which I think is only a couple of people, just dived into that and produced the system that's incredibly good and incredibly fast. And I think that's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm excited about all the stuff that we're building in Positron and getting that into the hands of more users. But on the AI front, I think I'm excited for some of the hype to settle down, so that, and for there to be maybe not 10 new AI tools to look at every week. And so I think for there to be a little more consolidation, and then for folks like us who are just trying to make people more productive, we can focus on fewer things and just have the goal be to be make people more productive. And so as usage of these different tools and however many different LLM models are out there I think more consolidation and fewer things for us to, look at, to integrate with, I think will be a good thing. So, and I expect that the next 12 months should be good in terms of like settling down some of the hype, and having more consolidation in the AI space.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us all, Wes and Hadley. I know the Hangouts normally go by really quickly, but this hour has been the fastest of all of them. So thank you all so much for all the great questions and taking the time to join us as well. As a reminder, if you had fun today and want to find out about other Posit events, I'm going to share a link for you to subscribe to find out about those. But also, I would love to hear from you and hear what your thoughts were on today's session. I'm going to share a three-question survey with you in the chat, just in case it doesn't pop up at the end of the meeting for you. And if there were questions that we didn't get to that you want to hear more about, we'd love to chat more with you too. But wishing you all a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. Thank you all.
Thank you.